What to do with the starting image, so I think this is probably the best I can manage. I'm going to be handling the Central Front series. Give you a little bit of my history with it first. I'm not going to give you my personal history right now. Wow, except it's fucking cold out. Yeah, I took a slip on the ice among other weird things that have happened. But this is pretty damn close to as early in my gaming history as you can kind of get, and I wonder what these are. I'm not completed with setting up yet. It has been an extraordinarily heavy trial. Now, the game started off, 5th Corps was a magazine edition. I don't have the magazine covers for the two that came out early in my subscription, 5th Corps and Beor. Once I got Beor, I jumped back and went out and bought Hof Gap, or as a friend of mine used to call it, Hot Gap. And, I mean, I played 5th Corps. I don't think I tried to link 5th Corps and Beor because I had moves at the time. Not sure which one it is. This is one of them. I think this is the one. But there are two moves issues that came out about the same time as Beor did to handle the fact that the West German army especially was, these are illegal. Were being modified. The whole organization was being changed during the period that these games came out. And a proposal of what that modification was put into place for 5th Corps and for Hof Gap. But I told you my friend called it Hot Gap. Really, I don't know. It doesn't look like it to me, but when he saw it, and that was just how he made fun of it from then on. Anyway, I played the 5th Corps to begin with. It's kind of like, I don't know. I'm really excited about the subject matter. It's, World War III in Europe starting out with a massive Russian invasion, some surprise in the factor, and initially it had no nuclear rules or anything like that. By the time Beor came out and those expansions came, significant optional rules were added in one of the two expansions. And I couldn't fit this thing on my table. I probably could have fit it if it was all level. But the fact that 5th Corps juts out and doesn't really fit in the board, in with the other boards, I would have had to come up with some solution. And this is actually the game that convinced me, not the only one, but it was the game that first convinced me of the idea that I wanted modular tables. And I've told the story before. I almost bought, or I was bidding on a bunch of little tables on wheels, about half the size of these, from a hairdressing salon. I don't know, it was a whole bunch of them, and I figured I could use them to configure just about anything. But what I found is that these guys are pretty good. The only problem with them is they don't quite fit the entire, like the map sheet is a little smaller than the table, which I guess is okay. It's better than a little bigger, but I have to use things like table extenders, which are going to be kind of tricky. Got to make sure not to bump them, especially this one with all these counters stacked up for entry. Like I said, the game is World War III in Europe. I tried playing it out in my garage. Now, the table in my garage was about this high. Sorry, my hand's really shaking. I think, and there was just no way I could reach the edges of it. It was like a gardening table. So I ended up climbing up on the plywood on that and trying to play it. I lost a few pieces, I think, doing that. I'm not sure. but there are a few missing pieces, which is okay because all of the pieces in the game were reproduced in order to match these other two. Now, the game was supposed to originally be 9 maps, stretching, this is just the initial invasion, stretching deeper in so that, you could have the Soviets making their way into France and Belgium and whatnot. But all they got out in the original offering was these 3. And then SPI folded into TSR. I think these guys are TSR. I'm not positive. I can see very easily. I don't see a TSR on here. Huh. It might be 3W. Same designer. I didn't think that was the case. I'm looking to see who the publisher was. Huh. Strangely, it's not saying. Usually publication information is given. Here, oh, this is 3W already, okay. So yeah, these two came out in 3W's era. TSR apparently said no, or maybe Camp said no. By the time that the next 2 games, North German Plain and Donau Front, came out, things had changed significantly in terms of, the military capabilities and organization. And Camps revamped the system, made a simplified system for these 2 games, and used counters that are very, very different. I have them here, garish counters of their era, as opposed to the kind of nice stuff, and the maps aren't as pretty either. Everything, it's funny because they have the same color, but they're not printed on the same kind of stock. So they have similar colors, but not the same quality. And the glossy counters on a glossy map, just not something I like. All right. And unfortunately, you couldn't combine the games. That's where some brilliance comes in. Not by the designer. I want to give credit to this guy, though, because although it was Dick Vollers, and I think there may be an improved version of this, he came up with an estimate, which is kind of what I was thinking I would do, of what the units should be in these new games to retrofit them to fit the old original game. And came up with whole counter sheets and everything. Unfortunately, the version of the counter sheet I printed out, probably about 2014 to be honest, has some errors in it. And I can't be sure, how much I've corrected things right, but I've tried to follow what he has down, etc. Okay. Setting this up was an absolute fucking nightmare. I did try to play the 3-map version again, I think, when I was in Buffalo. Every time I've played this, it's been kind of a miserable experience. I do not like the game. Nevertheless, it's been on my short list, and I've always felt like I should like it. One of the problems is I'm not big into operational games. It's kind of shocking that I like, say, OCS as much as I supposedly do, at least. I've played a couple of them, right? And with its explicit supply movement and all that, and its more complex type of combat system. But there were things about this that really appealed to me. One of them is it relies on this concept, at least the original does, the 2 newer ones do not, of friction points, which I don't have sorted yet. It's a big bag of counters. And essentially what happens is when a unit gets moved, it'll flip over to the white side. Normally units start the turn on their black side. And that indicates they've expended some effort and they're a little tired now, right? But then you alternate pulses, and any units that you moved, flipped over, they don't actually have to move, during your first impulse or whatever, first pulse, you can move some more. They won't be as effective at movement, and each time they move, they'll accrue another point of friction. Now, for the biggest units in the game, once they've accrued 5 points of friction, which is the biggest counter you can have, a 4, beneath a flipped over counter, then they can't voluntarily do anything. And the first hit that they take will destroy them. Damage in the combat table is also going to come from in the form of friction points. And I guess the idea is that whatever whatever happens due to friction points, you're able to recover 1 friction point each turn. So if you move one time in one impulse, or do combat or whatever, you're flipped over and you'll unflip. In order to get back your friction points that you've accumulated that are beyond that first one, you have to not move and rest. And that resting not only reflects actual rest and repair work on vehicles and whatnot, but also supplies being able to come in greater quantities, etc., so the stragglers returning, whatever. So it's a big abstraction of an idea, but one that allows units to recover without having to worry about all kind of replacement points and all kind of stuff like that being on the table. It may not be 100% accurate, but the other mechanisms were not either. For the combat itself, I don't know if I have it. It's probably not visible. Some of it is. Yeah. It uses a combat table that's reminiscent of, and I think after, the Desert Fox table, that basically, it's not like it. But, so that table gave shifts in a different sort of way than this does, but this gives shifts as well. But where the terrain type was compared against an odds ratio, that gives you a column. This is not as complex nor as exciting. That one had morale in there and all kind of other stuff factored in. This may be an earlier type of table that predates the one in Desert Fox, which I think is absolutely brilliant. But I found some similarity to this, when really all it really is some column shifts that are just built in so that you don't have to have a terrain effects column shift. You have it baked into the combat table to make things simpler. This also has the concept of combat on the move, where you will be spending operations points. Every time you spend a friction point to get an impulse with units, you get a dozen operations points basically, and you can spend some of them to launch an attack. And the idea of a prepared versus a hasty or even a march attack, as opposed to rules that are just you attack during the combat phase, here you're attacking during the movement phase as you spend the ops points. And with the addition of overrun rules in games, that's being replaced by this mechanism. Now, I don't know if the effects are all that different, and we'll see why when we take a look at the rules. But yeah, the setup was really painful for me, because when I did the do-it-yourself counters, well, you can see some of them didn't glue too well. One thing I can say, most of them didn't glue too well. One thing I can say, I tried something weird. Normally when I print counters, I put them on, what do I want to say? Basically manila folders that I cut up. is what I tended to use. I could steal those from work or, find them in the trash sometimes, whatever. And so I tended to have a lot of manila folders lying around that were used or whatever, and I would use them as the basis. But they ended up very thin counters. And here I thought, why don't I try corrugated cardboard box? And so I did that, and it is kind of interesting. I don't know how well it'll work in play. I've never actually played this one with these counters. But they have the required thickness, but they have a squishiness to them. And I don't know, the glue job is as bad as, is no worse than I would have done with the regular sheets. One thing that didn't work out too well is I cut them with an X-Acto, which I think I would have used for the other mechanisms as well. Some of the counters ended up really, really getting butchered, and we'll see a few examples of those. These guys are, I think, about as good as I can expect, but you got overhang, that's from the corrugation. When you cut it, some of the corrugation slips under the knife and then pops back up, and it's like, I can't really cut things properly. Some of them have, some of the printed material misaligned a little bit from the cut, whatever. But I did find, and this was a nightmare, and it's why this game has taken so long to get it back, other than the fact that, sorting everything was just really hideous. And, I'm playing so much Raid, I don't have the kind of time that I used to have when I worked or whatever. I'm also wasting my time in other things and sleeping and whatever to degrees that I wouldn't normally or didn't used to. So I just don't have, I don't have the energy, etc. Here's one that ended up, too skinny. Got worse examples, we'll see. But when I started setting it up, I was okay with all the stuff that went in the new one. And it was a big bonus for me because I never made the replacement counters for the German army before. I just used the old German pieces, and it was probably okay. They're not that different, but the setup hexes and everything are very different. But when I got to the new versions, what I found was in a lot of cases, first of all, Vollers or whatever did not note that he was estimating by formation and created new counters for units that weren't in the original game, so they're not in the setup sheets for these. He didn't provide any new setup sheets or anything. He just said set it up as per, and basically the rules that came in this moves here, and they're in that move still, in conjunction with the Bauer rules and the rules from the two other games. Well, it worked just fine when I did the first 3 maps. These other 2 maps, some of the counters are just out of nowhere. Plus, he did add some stuff that he kind of alluded to in his description, some engineering counters and stuff like that, where I'm just not sure how much is fudge, how much is not. I had to, I tried to keep as many of the original counters as I could for various reasons. For the West Germans, I couldn't do that at all. Well, I largely couldn't do that. There are a few on the board. But anyway, so I had a real nightmare. And then some of the counters are yeah, they can be used on one map or the other. So you got things like this, although that came from the original upgrade for Bauer. But there's just some stuff that's in a state of flux, which is another reason why things aren't completely set up. I'm not entirely sure what I don't like about the game. I guess we're going to find out some more. I don't expect to finish it. It doesn't go all that long. You can see these are 12 turns, 9 turns, 10 turns. I think it's 14 for the whole grand campaign together. Have I played bigger operational games than this? I don't know if I have. Which is one of the things, it's that may be the problem. Is it just too big? It's I know my OCS buddies break out the huge ones, and I want to someday, and I will, I swear. I mean, DAC was up there on this list too, but this one was the one that won out for some reason, largely because the rules are easier to approach. I love Dean Essig's rules, and I hope he gets better. I haven't heard anything. He got in another crash. You know, I think it's worse than that. I think he had a heart attack and his car crashed, but I don't remember exactly. But that was about last week or so. Somehow I'm just finding that SPI rules really hit a sweet spot for me when they can fit the formula properly. And this game seems to fit the formula relatively well in terms of like, I just know where to find and what to find. And one of the reasons for that, some of it's the standardization, but some of it's the column layout. This is about the perfect size for when I had reasonable eyes. I can still read now, but it gets harder when the light gets worse, okay? And it's gonna get worse, I know, with years. It's just gonna keep getting worse and worse. But this triple column layout, without a lot of images, the headlining the way it is and everything, it's all very easy for me to remember where something is likely to be. And because they get a lot of words per page, I was noting this on a BGG thing, thread or something. Just because it was on my mind, I kind of muscled it into the thread for no good reason. But because they can fit more words per page, I have less places to look. And then sort of the visual, if there is a little bit of visual difference between each page, and there always is, my mind just gets sort of a memory of that. You put too much color and pictures in something, I can't remember shit. My brain doesn't work on that much chaos, right? You put big cross-the-page paragraphs the way GMT writes its rules, and A, there's more pages I have to look through. B, it's not as structured, so it's harder to find things, you know, there aren't as many case points and whatever. And finally, that across the page look, I find that distorts my ability to find stuff. Maybe Avalon Hill has close to the worst of all rules, but maybe the very worst of all is the Aquinto games. Which is funny, because both they and Avalon Hill go with a lot of case points, a lot of numbering and everything. The Aquinto puts one per sentence, basically, and stretches the sentence across the page. And what's worse is they lay out their pages instead of like this, so that they kind of go like this, so that they're longer. And it's just horrible. I find the rules absolutely difficult to read. GDW is sort of, I don't know, kind of somewhere in between, but I don't find that terribly easy to read. What I did find easier to read was Victory Games and the old Gamers stuff, both of which relied on a slightly different columnar format, which was kind of like 2/3 of the page as one column and 1/3 of the page as kind of an auxiliary column where examples and notes and such not would often go. I found that pretty helpful too. I still think I like the SPI format better. I think I remember it better, although like from a visual appeal, I think I like that 2/3, 1/3 viewpoint better. Anyway, let's talk a little bit about the pieces. Even though I don't have them all out, we looked at the numbers. For units, you have nothing too complex here. You know, a unit designation, a type of unit, and then an attack and defense strength. Movement is not on there. Like I said, each unit gets 12 ops points. Let's see if we can find something, because there is a little funkiness to some of these counters. So artillery in between their attack and defense, have an artillery range, the range at which, you know, they can bombard and whatnot. And then, looking. Okay, there's units like this, which have a little triangle, or in the Vohers versions, supposedly it's an underline. There we go. That is their mobile combat capability. Oh, it's Pussy! Sorry. I have to say that every time I see that cat. Anyway. I really like that cat. He's beautiful, but can't coax him to come close or anything ever. Anyway. Hunt's behind my house, but is definitely someone's cat. It's not like just is able to roam freely in my neighborhood. The mobile combat is going to be used when there's going to be two types of possible combat, having nothing to do with whether it's prepared, hasty march, right? Mobile combat is that you launch the attack in a certain way, which can be just as prepared as the other, but you use the mobile combat strengths. And those are used for both attack and defense. And what we'll see is that, you know, the infantry doesn't do so well in the mobile side. And here's like an armored unit. Yeah, they specify even on defense, it's got a weaker mobile side, but it still far outstrips the infantry. It's not as good. Anyway, that's just something you're able to do. If you do a mobile attack, it restricts some of the artillery capabilities and whatnot. The game's going to cover stuff like EW jamming. I'm trying to remember what's original, what's not. The Warsaw Pact units enter in specific formations and operate according to some rigid doctrines that are really going to weaken their capabilities to fight. But on the other hand, they have chemical weaponry. One of the things that really kind of ended this game's run for me, not that I played it much, I probably played 5th Corps and Beor each, probably 5th Corps a couple of times, then tried to play the combined a couple of times, and that's it, you know? Which is less than most of my games, and some of it just has to do with this really awkward shape that the game the game takes as a footprint. But now I'm capable of doing it without any problem. But yeah, one of the things that really kind of sidelined this game was when Victory Games came out with NATO, which was same basic topic. This scenario could be played out on it. If you ignore the nuclear war rules in NATO, you pretty much get this. And at a scale or scope, well, at a scale really, that I preferred for looking at things. And it kept the game smaller. It was playable. You know, this thing was not very playable. There's always this enticement to play monsters for me, but it's a lot weaker when I'm looking at operational games than it is when I'm looking at, you know, let's do Gettysburg as a monster, and I just keep wanting to expand the scope of it. And I got a couple that should do that, but yeah. I guess I can just kind of dive into the rules. I've got some stuff here, and I don't really know. So these are counters that were made for the optional rules and for some other stuff, like to handle blown bridges and stuff, that just were not covered in the original rules of the game. And there's some other options, West German territorial units, that aren't covered in the original rules of the game. Some of it had to do with the counter mix for a magazine game. But then they came up with options for it, and it's like, well, gee, great, you know. I'm not going to make my own counters. Well, I ended up, but I didn't have to designed them. They gave designs, but in black and white, which is kind of goofy, as far as I'm concerned. As far as I know, stacking is two counters per hex, and I've got more than that in some places. Part of that is, I thought it was the North German plane and Donau front that had too many counters per hex only, which is because it was a different rule set. But now I'm seeing, wow, some of these have too many counters per hex too. And what's up with that? And I'm going to have to look that up, but I think some of them are going to have to shift off those spaces. That's what I did previously. All right. I know that I'm going to have to take breaks in this one. So let's start diving into the rules. The rules are scattered among many places. And I may not catch them all. I'm going to try to go as light as I can on the rules because they are an absolute mess as to how many different places they are. It's not as bad as setup was, and I'm not done with setup, it turns out. Like, I've got some units that are flipped over on their white side here, and those really should be on their black side with a 1-point counter under them. All right, okay. We'll try to go through this. I don't have a lot of room to put anything. Could use a different table, but I don't know. Normal layout for SPI gives all the unit types, whatnot. Sequence of play. So the first thing in each game turn is that both players lose 1 friction point from every unit on the board. If the unit's on white side up, it flips over. If it's not on white side up, it reduces its friction point quantity by 1. Then the NATO player will roll a die and see who has air power advantage. I haven't decided what I'm doing with this yet. In the original game, air power went exclusive. One side or the other had air dominance over the entire map. Vollers wanted to do, and he's got a couple of house rules, some of which I definitely don't like. This one I'm not sure about, which is that it gives the losing side like a quarter of the air points. That allows them to throw some extra air power in. I don't know how much I feel about that. Yes, it's probably more realistic, but it's also going to be more of a pain in the ass to deal with. It also might determine whether there's ground fog in the game. Ground fog is going to aid the attacker by hiding their movements as they're launching an attack. So for both sides, whoever is conducting an attack at a given point would get an aid from ground fog, potentially. I think maybe only in mobile combat. Or maybe only in non-mobile combat, I'm not sure. But it can be simulated by artillery releasing smoke. They can release smoke or chemicals for 1 friction point. They can bombard for 1 friction point. Those are cumulative. But the smoke and chemicals can be done together. Nuclear attack segment. Okay, nukes are in the game from the very beginning. I kind of feel like nukes are a problem. Now, we're talking tactical nukes here, but think about the situation in NATO, where one side uses nukes, tactical nukes, that may result in a full-out nuclear war. And that's a pretty good thumbnail of, how it was viewed. Now, Soviet doctrine at the time, and I don't think this game covers that, is that they would never use nukes on a first strike. They had the military advantage. NATO, and the US in particular, never stood up and said, we will not do a first strike with nukes. In fact, it was one of the things that kind of weirded me out back in the 80 election. Or maybe it was a later one, I don't remember. But where the Democratic presidential candidates, who were supposed to be not the warmonger, Republicans, still wouldn't commit against using nukes for a first strike. And the reason for it, and I did understand that at the time, the reason for it was if you're going to defend Western Europe, you might need the capability to stop those advancing hordes with possibly tactical, possibly strategic nukes. Okay. Then there's an initiative segment. This has been done away with in this version. It was decided that, look, the Soviets have the initiative for these maps. And it might be, if there were more maps going further west, that it would make sense for the NATO side to start, gaining initiative. All that does is it determines who will be the first player for the turn. It's not that big a deal. Now, during each player phase, the first player phase, you're allowed to start flipping your units and moving them. If they're in a location where they can conduct an attack right away, they can do a prepared attack. They can do a multi-hex attack. I don't remember the cost of a prepared attack. But normally, you can only attack with the stack that you're moving, unless you start the turn next to something, in which case you can conduct a multi-hex attack. Anyway, you spend your operations points, you do stuff on the map, you may launch certain attacks, etc. Then the second player gets to do the same thing. Now, after the first time that each player activates in a given turn, some of the units will have done something, and they'll be on their white side. Those are the only units which are allowed, some of the units will have moved, which will be on their white side. Those are the only units which can move in subsequent phases, and the subsequent phases work exactly the same way. You have as many of them as you like until both players pass. Conceivably, somebody could move one stack and just keep pushing the game out. I don't expect to see that happen, at least not solo, but I could see players being real dicks about that. I need to swap batteries. I knew I would. And probably change pipe because mine went out. So it's cold as all fuck right here right now. And, I mean, inside I can live, but these little baseboard heaters, they don't do this cavern. This thing would, but two problems. One, it's kind of crooked. And when I first moved in, I had the chimney cleaned. And the woman who did it was like, I'm not going up there again without, better equipment than I have. Like, my husband will do it with different equipment. And B, I don't really think that, I don't trust that isn't going to fall apart the way it's kind of bent. It was shaking and everything. I don't really know how unstable it is. I think it's pretty stable because there was an inspection and, that didn't come up as an issue. But it hasn't been cleaned in like 5 or 6 years, and I'm just worried about what's up there. Now, I don't use it very often, but that doesn't mean there's not nasties up there that might not catch fire, like a bird's nest or something. And then B, I got a fucking tree branch on top that is dry. I'm just really terrified. I haven't been able to get that off. Anyway, let's start looking at what we got. Movement is pretty reasonable based on, it's pretty standard. We've got an operations point cost. Like I said, you get 12 operation points by activating something. You pay operations points for moving into different terrain. Now, there is something kind of weird here. I should have explained this earlier on. I stand up to show stuff. I got my tweezers over there. We'll use a pencil. Okay. So, most of the terrain looks pretty normal. You got these red dots, those are towns, no big deal, they have an effect on combat. But what is weird is these little diamonds here. Those are all over the place. Those indicate roads, small roads, between hexes. So instead of creating a mess of roads, because honestly, you know, here we are in West Germany, I think across the board, no? Yeah, it has to all be. What's in the south here? Landau. Yeah, because Austria's under those counters. Yeah, instead of putting a mass of all the little roads that are everywhere, they're being represented by these diamonds. And that just indicates that there's reasonable transit between those hexes without cluttering the map with way too many, with another color and way too many markings. So when you hit where it says access hex sides, that's 1. You'll see roads and autobahns have the same movement cost. Yeah, but not always. Autobahns, things can move a little faster on them in general. One biggie is when a unit has already moved in the current game turn, on its second impulse that it's moving, it's going to pay an extra movement point per hex. Now, I believe that's one of the places where the Autobahn gives you a bonus. You're not allowed to do anything once you're at max FPs, and here are the costs for the different attacks. Leaving a zone of control has a cost of 6 and may not work. I gotta relight. When you move into an enemy controlled zone of control, you have to stop, and you can't move unless you succeed in spending, you have to stop moving. You can't move any further unless you succeed in dislodging it through a combat action with that same stack that was moving. Artillery and attack helicopters are allowed to do things that expend friction points without moving. Without flipping over. They just expend a friction point in order to like fire their artillery or release stuff, or for helicopters to do a helicopter support, etc. .12 is of some importance here. Yeah, so the additional operation point for every hex moved, on an Autobahn, it's only a half extra point per hex move, but not on a road. So roads cost you 1.5 movement each. I don't remember what clear costs. I'm hoping it's 1. Yeah, okay. It's not obvious. There might be multiple terrains in a given hex. You pay the largest, you pay the predominant terrain, but crossing rivers and whatnot is cumulative. It is possible to enter the map as reinforcements. Units come in as a column of units, 1 per hex, I believe, on a road or Autobahn. Enemy units are able to leave the game map under certain special conditions. Once they do so, they're off map, but they may actually help you win the scenario. Zones. Okay, not everything exerts a zone. They say everything does, but artillery, attack helicopters, and engineers do not, I believe. There are also small units like companies or something that don't give as big a zone or as powerful a zone. Zones of control don't extend into cities. They extend out of them, but not into them. If you want to exit an enemy zone of control, if you want to move all your units out, you expend 6 operation points extra and roll a die. If you get a 3 or less, you're allowed to move. Otherwise, you're not allowed to move, you're not allowed to attack, and you are not allowed to continue, you're not allowed to essentially spend extra operations points for the turn. However, if you're in an enemy controlled space, and you leave at least one unit that exerts a zone of control in the hex, you're allowed to leave. You still pay the 6 extra, but you don't have to roll a die. Conceivably, you could, like, I guess, move all your units except one, if it was really important that you get out of there, and then try to move that one later on. A unit that moves out of an enemy-controlled hex cannot move into any enemy-controlled hexes in the current player phase. That's a little different from most games. Stacking. Warsaw Pact can never have more than 3 units in a hex. A regiment-sized unit can never stack with another regiment-sized unit. I'm going to have trouble reading the size of the units. It's tiny. The NATO player may never have more than 2 units in a hex. Units of different nationalities may not stack together. A NATO unit of one nationality can be moved through a hex containing another nationality, but it can't end in that. A stack of units can move together for operations points. Friction points are assessed per stack, but with exceptions for artillery and helicopters. And there's an option, which I probably will play with, which is that every unit will just have its own friction points. I just feel like that works better. Because they have, like, rules on averaging friction points and figuring out what should be there. I just feel like that's no fun. Okay. Combat. You have to be adjacent in order to combat. You state which enemy-occupied hex is under attack and which units are participating in it. You declare the type of attack that you're spending for and whether you're doing mobile or normal. Finally, all your involved units have to expend ops points in order to make the attack. The attacker can commit non-adjacent artillery, attack helicopters, and air points to his attack, and he can declare the use of smoke and chemicals. He can also use electronic warfare. Electronic warfare is an attempt to basically screen the attack so that the defender isn't able to bring defensive artillery or helicopters into play. If the attacker does not get away with his EW, the defender can commit artillery and attack helicopters that are not under attack and air points to aid his defense. He can also declare the use of chemicals. No reason you'd use smoke. It only aids the attacker. And the attack strength of all attacking units is totaled and compared to the defense strength to get a normal odds chart. If it's a mobile attack, you only use the mobile combat strength for both players instead of the attack defense. But if a unit doesn't have mobile, I think it defaults back to attack defense. The combat ratio determines the column that you use. You roll a die, compare it to the type of attack that you're using, and you get a result, which is going to be friction points on the attacker on the left and friction points on the defender to the right. But the defender has some capability, and we'll get to that, to retreat instead of taking friction points. You normally can only attack with a single stack. However, if your stack has not moved, other stacks adjacent to the enemy hex, which have also not moved, can be thrown into the attack. Other stacks, whole stacks. All of the attacking units could have spent no operation points so far. They have to be eligible. You must do a prepared attack in this case. And all the involved non-artillery spend 6. If the Warsaw Pact player is conducting the attack, all of his involved units must be of the same division. Again, divisional coordination is going to be pretty big for the Russians, well, for the Warsaw Pact as a whole. But it's going to be tough for me to see, and I may end up getting units accidentally involved with the wrong formation. Too bad. I'm sure that they're not as rigid as they're placed in this game, but I'm also sure that the rigidity is more important than trying to create exceptions. But if exceptions happen through the course of, not being able to read, such is life, especially where counters are unreadable. If NATO conducts the attack, all of the involved units have to be of the same nationality. If it's a multi-hex, this is only multi-hex. If a multi-hex attack is conducted, the attacker receives a column shift in his favor for each hex in excess of 1 that contains attacking units adjacent to the defending units. Artillery and attack helicopters taking part in this attack do not count towards this column shift. After a multi-hex attack is resolved and any advances after combat have been completed, the ops expenditure of all the participating stacks, except for the one stack, as deployed at the instant of combat, I think as declared at the instant of combat, of the phasing player's choice is considered completed. Modifiers. Terrain is mainly built into the integrated combat results table, but there may be some. Are rivers on here? See, rivers are not on here, and I think that they have an effect, so I'm looking for them. Towns and rivers are noted on the table. Combat modifiers. Here we go. So like a town is one shift to the left. If it's separated by a river, it's 4 columns to the left. Rivers are big. If not all of the units are attacking through a river, but some of them are, it's 2 columns to the left. But an engineer reduces this to 1 column to the left for river crossing, no matter what. Cities get reduced to rough if there's an engineer in the attack. If all 6 hexes adjacent to the defending units are enemy occupied or controlled, it's a column shift to the right. This won't affect cities, and I think non-direct fire artillery doesn't count on this. The multi-hex is there. Mobile attack and ground fog is in effect, or smoke is projected. You get 1 column in the attacker's favor to the right. And like I said, you roll a die, you get a FP result for both sides. If artillery is conducting direct fire, it'll be affected by the combat results. And it doesn't have to pay an extra point. It pays the operations points for the attack, and then it's just treated as a normal unit. Artillery doing indirect fire is never affected by combat. Attack helicopters, however, are always affected, even though they work kind of like indirect fire. The defender is allowed to reduce the FP gain required by a combat result by retreating his attacking units. If he does so, however, the attacker's result may also be reduced, and they may be able to advance. If a unit gains an FP or FPs so that it has more than its maximum level, it's considered destroyed. The biggest units can hold 5 FPs total, 1 for the counter itself, and up to 4 on the numbers. Smaller units can't hold that many. Mobile combat has to be in flat or broken terrain. What's broken? It's not that dark brown. That's got to be rough. Broken is this pale green. Okay. There are no map keys on the 2 new ones. There's no turn chart. It feels like, I don't know. Just so much more amateurish in terms of everything. I don't know. Anyway, where are we? Artillery and attack helicopters, when supporting mobile combat, have a strength of 1, except for Warsaw Pact artillery using direct fire, which has a strength of 2. Warsaw Pact is doubled for direct fire no matter what. But if a mobile attack is conducted while ground fog is in effect, there's a column shift. We talked about that. But results against the defender in mobile combat are reduced by 1. Okay. If the defender gets an FP gain of 2 or more from combat, he can choose to fulfill part of the result by retreating all the defending units instead of gaining FPs. At least 1 FP must be gained by all the units whenever a combat result is incurred. There's an exception, but I don't understand it yet. Yeah. Okay, I haven't touched on this. Some of the units, oh boy, this is going to be hard to find one, are soft. Not many. Okay, here's one that's easy to find. A helicopter, an attack helicopter, is considered a soft target. That can't retreat until it's taken 2 friction points in an attack. And you'll see, like, standard artillery is probably soft targets as well. There's some infantry. If you start air mobilizing units, they go soft on you. Okay. Retreats are always conducted by the owning player. However, the defender has restrictions on it. Has to retreat not into an enemy-controlled or occupied hex, nor off the game map. Cannot retreat across a river unless the hex side has a bridge. You must retreat into a vacant hex if possible. If not, they can retreat through a friendly occupied hex, but not in violation. A unit must retreat into a connected autobahn or road if possible, if all the other requirements have been fulfilled. And you must retreat into the hex requiring the fewest operation points to enter. If you have nothing permissible to retreat, you must stand and take your friction points. A NATO unit may end its retreat in a hex occupied by a NATO unit of a different nationality. Normally you can't if no other hex is available. As long as they're stacked, they can defend together, but they cannot be supported by any indirect fire or attack helicopters, and they cannot attack. So, if a stack is being retreated, it may not be split up. A unit with a soft target must gain 2, yeah. If the defender chooses to retreat, any combat result incurred by the attacker is reduced by 1. And they will get to advance. They may anyway. A unit must end up as many hexes away from its original hex as the number of hexes it retreats. Okay. When a defending unit is retreated or eliminated, there is a path of retreat left behind, if it retreats. After the attacker's combat result has been fulfilled, any and all victorious attacking units are allowed to advance along the enemy path of retreat and may deviate from it. The advance does not require any ops points. The permissible length of the advance after combat is equal to the number of hexes that the defender retreated, i.e. didn't pay friction points for that they should have. If all the defending units in combat are eliminated, the length of the advance is the additional friction points that they didn't fulfill. Advancing units can ignore enemy zones of control. By the way, all the units take that friction point loss. So even if I'm tracking friction points on each unit individually, still the entire stack is what's taking the friction point losses. That's an important thing to consider. It's not like there's steps that are being lost or whatever, and a larger force has more staying power. It all is taking the friction points. Advancing units can ignore the enemy zone of control as long as they're being advanced along the path of retreat. If a unit is advanced after combat, the first hex entered must be the hex occupied originally by the defending units at the instant of combat. If an advance of greater than 1 hex is allowed, the unit can advance into any adjacent hex, but if the unit deviates from the path of retreat, the advance must stop as soon as it enters an enemy-controlled hex. You immediately deviate the path of retreat if the defender did not retreat. Artillery conducting indirect fire and attack helicopters may not be advanced after combat. Artillery conducting direct fire may. A unit that didn't participate in the current combat but that is stacked with a unit that did may advance after combat. I'm not sure how yeah, that is possible. Okay. The attacker may cease to advance. One thing that I can think of that makes it possible, I don't know if you want to advance in this, is if a unit has too many friction points and can't do anything. The attacker may cease to advance his units at any point during their advance. This is never required to advance. They can advance units and drop them off along the way. But, yeah. they can advance into different hexes as well. Unit may be advanced across an unbridged river hex side only if it is entering the hex occupied by the defending unit at the instant of combat. They already expended and took lots of column shift for that. Friction points. Okay. All regiments, artillery, and attack helicopters have an FP of 5 max. Battalions, including the West German territorial and static infantry battalions, which already exist in here, there were no counters for them, but okay. All regiments, all battalions, including West German territorial and static infantry battalions, have a maximum FP of 4. All companies have an FP of 3. There shouldn't be a lot of companies in the game. I think the engineers are companies. These guys are battalion size. Oh, this is a company size. Yeah. Some Belgian armored cav. You gain them in lots of different ways. You remove them 1 per turn. We know how to record them. A unit on its non-FP side can expend operations points in the owner's initial phase. Once it's only, a unit on its FP side must expend 1 additional operation point for every hex it enters when it's being moved. You can always do fire support, including helicopters, regardless of the player phase and whether you're on your FP side. You can choose to flip your units over and not spend your ops points if you so wish on the first phase. A unit that's reached maximum FP can't spend ops points on any manner. It can't destroy itself. All right. In order to remove friction points, you have to be in supply. If you're not in supply, you don't reduce it. The unit is in supply if it can trace a supply line to the supply source. Okay, real simple, right? Supply line is going to be 2 segments. The first segment is a path of hexes leading from the hex occupied by the tracing unit to a road or autobahn that will cost the unit no more than 6 ops points to cross on its non-FP side. The second segment is a path of connected road and autobahn hexes leading from the last hex of the first segment to a friendly supply source, and it's got to be unbroken. You can't trace supply through an enemy-occupied hex or enemy-controlled unless you have a friendly unit occupying the hex that you're tracing through. A supply line may not be traced through an unbridged river hex side unless there's a friendly engineer adjacent to that hex side. Swamp, marsh, or rough. Okay, this is weird. Yeah, there's a typo here. Yeah, you also can't go through swamp, marsh, or rough unless transferred by a road or autobahn. Exclusive rules determine where the supply sources are. For the Soviets, it's basically the east end of the map, but there's a possibility for them to grab airborne supply sources that are limited. There are air bases on the map. There's one here, which if the Soviets manage to capture, they can use that as a limited supply source. For the Allies, I think in general they're going to be off that western edge of the map, but we'll look as needed. We're going to have to switch batteries again and light a pipe again pretty soon. But let's finish up supply. Okay, NATO cannot trace supply through East Germany or Czechoslovakia. There's a scenario where they're allowed to go into Czechoslovakia, so I don't know if that stays that way. The Warsaw Pact cannot trace a line of supply through a city hex, which a Warsaw Pact unit was not the last to pass through. The game being played, Warsaw Pact units will be automatically in supply for a number of game turns, and I think it's a fairly large number. I don't know if it's 4 or 6, but given the size of the scenario, they're basically able to plow forward with heavy supplies no matter what. Warsaw Pact artillery, though, are not automatically in supply. and they cannot remove friction points to do that. All right, we're gonna swap batteries and set ourselves up with another lit pipe. My tea is still there, it's cold, but it's still there. Artillery are able to fight in either direct or indirect fire. They can also release chemicals and smoke and conduct counter battery fire. Rocket artillery are allowed to fire more intensively and get a bonus from that. The attacker declares all his artillery units involved first, then the defender does. The defender can throw nasty surprises if the attacker doesn't EW them. An artillery unit that's stacked with non-artillery can participate in an attack against an adjacent unit by conducting direct fire. Warsaw Pact artillery is doubled in strength for direct fire. An artillery unit in a stack containing at least one non-artillery unit that is attacked by enemy units must participate in the defense with direct fire. An artillery unit conducting direct fire while attacking contributes its attack strength to that of the attacking non-artillery. An artillery unit conducting direct fire while defending contributes its defense strength. There's a lot of words for it works like you would expect. If a mobile attack has been declared by the attacker, an artillery unit contributes its mobile attack combat strength, which may be doubled in the case of the Warsaw Pact. Okay. You can use any number of eligible artillery units, however there are restrictions as to what can be used. An artillery unit that is under attack when alone in a hex or stacked with only artillery or attack helicopters and or when possessing 5 FPs has a defense strength of 1. An SP, self-propelled artillery, possesses a defense strength of 2 in these situations unless its base defense is actually only 1. The attack strength of all Warsaw Pact artillery units except rockets are doubled when doing direct fire. I wish it had said that elsewhere. The exception. Their defense strength is unaffected. The bonus is applied when a mobile attack has been declared, but it's only a strength of 1. If a unit's conducting direct fire, it is affected by the combat results. An artillery unit that is not in an enemy-controlled hex can participate in an attack against an enemy unit by conducting indirect fire. In order to do so, the artillery unit must be within range. The artillery unit not in an enemy-controlled hex may participate in the defense of a friendly unit under attack by conducting indirect fire if within range of the friendly unit. An artillery unit is within range if you count the hexes. You're not allowed to count off map, which I feel is kind of cheap, but I don't know. An artillery unit that is in an enemy-controlled hex and not eligible to conduct direct fire may conduct indirect fire if all enemy units controlling the hex are involved in the current combat. So this is a kind of a weird thing, right? You're in a position that looks like it's direct fire. It's not. But you're allowed to fire. But not if pinned down by another unit. A Warsaw Pact artillery can conduct indirect fire only if the following restrictions are met. The artillery cannot be stacked with a non-artillery. A prepared attack is being conducted if the Warsaw Pact players attacking. They're allowed to defend otherwise with artillery no matter what. The artillery unit is the same division as all the divisional non-artillery units in the combat. Like I said, formations matter. But this doesn't apply if the artillery unit is non-divisional. It's going to be a nightmare to figure that out sometimes, probably. A NATO artillery unit may not conduct indirect fire in a combat if any of the involved NATO non-artillery units are of a different nationality. An artillery unit conducting indirect fire is not affected by combat results. And a hex containing an artillery unit conduct indirect fire in a multi-hex attack does not count towards any column shifts bonuses received for that attack. Okay. Whenever artillery fires, it spends a friction point. Whenever it releases chemicals and smoke, it expends a friction point. Smoke gives you an advantage in the mobile attacks. Chemicals give you column shifts, which are dependent on the turn and the scenario being played. They're better early on. Any number of friendly artillery can conduct counter battery fire in the friendly player phase, as long as none of them have yet expended operations points in the phase and they're not in enemy zone of control. Each artillery unit can conduct counter battery fire against one enemy artillery unit within range. You declare and resolve the counter battery attack one at a time as follows. You declare the artillery unit is conducting counter battery fire, increase its FP by 1, or more in the case of rocket artillery if you wish. The attack strength of the attacking artillery is compared to the counter battery defense strength of the enemy artillery. The counter battery defense strength is 1 if the defending artillery is soft, 2 if it's hard. The attacker rolls a die, looks in the proper ratio column as if the prepared attack were being conducted in flat terrain, and gets a combat result. The attacker does not take any losses, only the defender. If the defender's result is 1 or greater, they have succeeded. And the big deal here is you're adding friction points to the enemy so they can't fire. Or maybe don't want to. When resolving counter battery fire, neither the attacker nor the defender gain any benefit from terrain, air points, smoke, fog, attack helicopters, or other modifiers. The attacking artillery may, however, use chemicals. Counter battery fire is selective. Any other artillery or non-artillery units stacked with the defending artillery ignored. No more than 1 attacking artillery unit and 1 defending artillery unit are involved in any single counter battery attack. Aside from gaining an FP, an artillery unit is not affected by conducting battery fire. It can do additional ones during the same player phase and do other stuff. An artillery unit that incurs any combat result in a counter battery fire may not be used to conduct any fire for the duration of the current player phase. So it's even further. If you took any hits at all, you are suppressed for being able to fire defensive fire. So that's actually pretty big. I didn't realize that, or I didn't remember it. I think I knew it at one point. Furthermore, you have to take the FP gain and or retreat as if it's a normal attack. If the artillery is hard, it must gain at least 1 FP before retreating. If it's soft, it must gain at least 2. But it only takes as many as it gets hit with. Now, rocket artillery, when you use rocket artillery, I think only, I was going to say only the Russians have it, but I think actually maybe there are some German ones. You can spend additional FP to multiply your combat strat and just blast away real hard. And, that can give you one hell of an attack. It's only used in your friendly player phase. It can be used for counter battery fire. It can be used for attacks. Rocket artillery are not doubled for direct fire, but you can pay. Okay. Attack helicopters. We're getting to the complex rules. An attack helicopter unit can be used to support any type of attack or defense as if it's indirect fire. The unit represents a base from which the actual unit on the board represents a base from which the helicopters operate. However, anytime an attack helicopter is involved in combat, it must gain any FPs required by the combat result. It has a printed range, it's like 30 hexes. If it's attacked on its own, it defends with a strength of 1, whether it's alone or stacked with other units. If it may not be retreated. If it's in an enemy-controlled hex, it cannot be used in support. 11.24 and 26. Okay, it counts as artillery for those two, but not 11.23. So it's not limited by the Warsaw Pact limitations on artillery, okay, which includes the same division, which the attack helicopters are all Army level, I think. Okay. Helicopters have their own FP levels. It's reduced by 1 during friction point removal. Artillery is able to reduce by 2. I think I failed to mention that. I always forget that, honestly. I wonder where it mentions it. Here we go. Yeah, I skipped over it really quickly. But artillery reduced by 2 each turn, whereas everything else reduces by 1. I'm glad I saw it. I saw that. Okay, both players get some units that are air mobile, and they also have units that can convert to air mobile. Well, they have airborne units, and they have units that can convert to air mobile. Air mobile, and we'll consider them all air mobile as a whole. Air mobile units can be moved from one hex to another by transport. I'm sorry. There are also paradrop. There are airborne units. There are units that are air mobile to begin with, and there are units that can be converted to air mobile. An air mobile unit can be flown from one hex to another by transport helicopters, which are not represented by counters on the board. But the attack helicopters indicate where the transport helicopters are based. You may move air mobile units only during game turns in which the enemy player does not have air superiority. Yeah, no doubt. The exclusive rules list the unit types that can be converted. During the friendly player phase, each attack helicopter can transport one air mobile unit a number of hexes up to the limit of the helicopter unit's range allowance. I don't believe there's any FP cost for... Nope, there is an FP for the helicopter. Yeah, so it's kind of weird. It's like, yeah, the attack helicopters are doing it, but they're not doing it. I don't know. Units can be converted to air mobile. Okay, how do you actually move the units? So you have to fly the helicopter, the hexes to the unit that it's going to pick up. You pick up the unit, that doesn't cost you anything. And then you fly a number of hexes with the unit. Now, while the unit is in the helicopter, on its way there, it is subject to air defense fire, which we'll hit later. But before that, it's not. The helicopter's not. Some units can be converted to air mobile status, and there are substitute counters. Basically, what you do is you grab the appropriate number of these for the unit you're converting, and you leave one of these little tank things, vehicles, whatever, as a dump behind. I'm not going to go into the details of this because I doubt I'm going to actually do this. It seems like a really horrible idea. It converts the unit into an air mobilized, easier to move around by helicopters, capable of moving around by helicopters, soft infantry unit that is not very effective, but might be vital for some special purpose. In order to get your heavy equipment back and recombine back into the original unit, you basically have to move air mobile units equivalent in size to what you created it out of, back to that equipment, and they eat up the equipment. If the equipment gets moved into by the opposing player, then it's gone and you will never be able to reconstitute those units. All right. Air defense fire when an air mobile, but there are some units that are just inherently air mobile. When an air mobile unit is being transported to its destination, it may be subject to enemy air defense fire. If the flight path of an air mobile unit passes through an enemy-controlled or enemy-occupied hex, the air mobile unit and the transporting helicopter each gain 1 FP immediately, and this is for every such hex that they move through. Air mobile units are non-motorized infantry. What's up with that? 5.33. I don't remember anything. Yes. Non-motorized units treat roads and autobahns as if they're access hex sites, which isn't that terrible, but it's also not great. Where are we? Air mobile units can only expend 6 ops points in the phase in which they're transported, but this can be done this can be done both before and after they're transporting. So you could move it a little, pick it up, move it, or you can pick it up, move it someplace, and then move it some more after you've inserted it, whatever. Air mobile units must be able to trace either a normal supply line or be supplied by airheads, just as if they're airborne units. We'll get to that. Warsaw Pact air mobile units are not subject to the restrictions of the Soviet doctrine or NATO surprise attack bonuses. those should both be covered. They're in the exclusive rules, but then they end up getting assimilated into the combined rules somewhere, and I'll find that. Air mobile are not considered considered non-divisional units for artillery support and the like. A Warsaw Pact attack helicopter that is located off-map may not transport them. An air mobile unit may be transported to any non-enemy occupied hex, and you can convert eligible units to air mobile to use them as leg infantry if you so desire. I don't think want to, but I don't know. Air power, like I said, you roll a die. The specific rules give you a number of air points that each side gets if they have superiority. Those air points cannot be saved. You can use them in attack or defense simply by adding the number of air points to the total strength of your units involved in that combat. You may use air points to release chemicals in combat. It costs you an air point to do so, and you don't get combat strength out of it. They can't be used for smoke, though. Air interdiction is another way you can use your air points. You strike against units when they are most vulnerable in transit. Air interdiction can be used only by the player with air superiority. You determine, person with air superiority can place FP markers as though they're air interdiction markers, and I may have special purpose air interdiction markers in that bag at this point. With a value of 1 to 4 on any hex not occupied by enemy units. For each FP represented, it's going to cost me an air point. During the remainder of the game turn, the first enemy unit or stack of units to enter that hex gains the FPs represented by that marker, and then the marker is removed from play. If no enemy enters the hex, the marker is removed at the end of the game turn. They can be placed anywhere on the map except those occupied by enemy units. The hexes you can place them in is limited only by the number of air points you have. However, no more than 4 can be put in a single hex. You may place them on your own units. They won't affect your units, but they will affect the enemy if the enemy moves into that hex. Air interdiction and reinforcements. If you place air interdiction on a reinforcement entry hex, friendly units scheduled to enter may instead be brought into play in an alternate entry hex. There's alternate entry rules for reinforcements if you block the... Anyway. On AM turns, it's possible that there'll be fog. That's just a bonus for the attackers if there's smoke everywhere. All right, we'll take a little pause. Hit airborne units. I think I'm out of chargers. So this may be an actual real pause. Okay, well, I let things charge for quite a while. All good now, but I'm awfully tired at this point. It's like daylight. What am I doing awake? All right, air mobiles, or airbornes. Okay, some of the units come in as airborne units, and they use the airdrop procedure. Once in play, they can trace supply either to an airhead, or normally. Each airborne unit that's eligible to enter in a game turn is placed in a drop hex by the phasing player. After they're all placed, you roll on the airdrop table once per unit to see how many FPs it gains. And we'll take a quick look at that. It's just, here's the air power table. We haven't taken a peek at that either. But anyway, the airdrop table, you just get a number of points. You get a bonus if you're dropping it in an airport or an airfield, and penalties based on terrain, as well as if neither player has air superiority. You can only drop if you have air superiority, which is what it just says here. And if neither player has air superiority, you're allowed to drop if there's no fog in effect. You do it as sort of the first thing in your pulsing. Well, before moving any other phasing units. I think you could do counter battery fire or something if you want it. You cannot drop in a city or rough an enemy controlled or enemy occupied, or a friendly occupied hex, or a hex assigned as a drop hex for another airborne unit. You just roll the die, see what you get. During the player phase in which the airborne unit is first placed, it gets 6 operations points to move, just like an air mobile. At the conclusion of that phase, the airborne unit gains an additional FP, whether it actually spent the operation points or not. Now, you'll see, you could get quite a few, and these are not big units, so they can get destroyed by dropping, I think. I'm looking to see. Okay, Warsaw Pact airborne units are not subject to the restrictions of Soviet doctrine, and the NATO player never gets surprise attack. I don't think we've hit surprise attack. Yeah, we have. If the NATO player is able to surround a Warsaw Pact unit, they get an advantage. I don't remember what it is. You know, I sort of ran through the combat rules and everything rather rapidly. And there it is. Completely surrounded by NATO units or their zones of control, the attacking units have their, and supporting helicopters have their strength doubled. So that's a big advantage. It's a surprise because Warsaw Pact is not expecting to get their units pocketed. They're expecting, their doctrine is to continue pushing forward at all times. So they're not really capable of shifting onto a defensive posture when they're pushing forward like this. Okay. Airborne airheads and airborne air mobile supply. Any airfield that's occupied by a friendly unit or was once occupied by a friendly unit and hasn't been retaken is a friendly airhead. During each game turn, that friendly player has air superiority or neither player has it. An airhead is considered operative and it can be used as a supply source. And for the Warsaw Pact player, as an entry hex for non-airborne, air-mobile, mechanized, or artillery units. An airborne or air-mobile unit can trace a line of supply to any valid supply source or to an operative friendly airhead. During the initial, this reminds me of the attack on Kiev, you know. During the initial Warsaw Pact player phase of any game turn in which he has air superiority, he can place one motorized rifle unit or one artillery unit only on one operative Warsaw Pact airhead, assuming the unit's scheduled to enter as a reinforcement in the current turn. If it's placed as such, it's an air-delivered reinforcement. Air-delivered reinforcements may not spend operations points during the player phase of entry, but they are flipped over to their FP side. If it's so placed, it's removed from the march order of its division if it's assigned to one. The Soviet units, I didn't really explain this, they come in a certain order that they're fixed and must enter in. Air-delivered reinforcement must trace a line of supply to a valid supply source. Operative airhead hexes can be used to supply up to 2 air-delivered reinforcement units per game turn, in addition to any number of airborne units. Regardless of how many airheads the Warsaw Pact player controls, no more than 2 air-delivered units may use them as supply sources in a single game turn. Engineers, rivers, and bridges. Here we hit some weird stuff. Okay. You can attempt to destroy bridges. Friendly engineers can be used to repair destroyed bridges and aid friendly units in crossing unbridged rivers. Engineers can also provide a column shift for friendly attacks into cities or across rivers. All right. You can attempt to destroy any bridge in West Germany during any friendly player phase. There's 2 ways you can do this: close and long-range demolition. In close range, you can make one demolition attempt per game turn on any bridge adjacent to a friendly unit during any part of the player phase in which the condition is met. When a friendly unit is adjacent to the bridge that's to be destroyed, you roll a die. On a 1 through 5, you destroy the bridge. Otherwise, it's intact after that attempt. Remember, you can only make one attempt, but I believe that's per bridge. It's hard to tell from the wording. Sometimes they're a little ambiguous, but each player can make one long-range demolition attempt per game turn on each bridge Yeah, see, here it says on any bridge, which indicates that you can only make one attempt across the board. I don't think that's the case. I think it's more this one long-range demolition per on each bridge on the map, regardless of whether a friendly unit is adjacent to it. The player announces during any part of his phase that the attempt is being made and rolls a die. Only on a 1 can he destroy the bridge. There's no markers for it. Well, Volher's put some markers together. Now, he has an optional rule, which is that for the Soviets to do this, his idea is that, look, there might be partisan units remaining in West Germany who could destroy bridges. For the Soviets to do it, they have to expend an air point. I don't feel like that's actually, I don't think that's what's being represented. I don't think it's the idea that there's Soviet partisans here, but there might be Soviet spy units in place, right? Just before the invasion, etc., that'll be in place and able to destroy the bridges. And likewise, local partisans might be exploding German bridges. So I'm, again, a little uncertain that I want to play with his house rule here. I don't know. You can make arguments either ways. Anyway, engineers and river crossings. When a stack contains an engineer is moved across an unbridged river hex or a destroyed bridge hex side, it only costs 1 operation point in addition to the normal terrain of the hex. An engineer occupying a hex with an unbridged river or destroyed bridge as one of its hex sides reduces the cost to cross to 1 additional ops point for any friendly unit moved through it. If an engineer remains adjacent to a destroyed bridge for a full game turn, it can rebuild the bridge. Reinforcements come on. I've already talked about how they have to come on. Oh, this is why we hadn't hit it. How they have to come on one after the other, and we've got the costs being listed here. It's either 1 or a half operation point, depending on if it's a road or an Autobahn. It's basically, so roads are only a half each, so this is kind of weird. Because they charge you, let's see. If an Autobahn leads off, the first unit brought in expends half an operation point, the second 1, the third. If a road leads off, the first unit spends half, the second 1.5. So roads are going to be harder to move onto the board on. I'm not sure why that's the case, because they actually have the same movement rate as the Autobahns do in general. If we take a look here, it's a half. See note 6, a unit moving along a road ignores other terrain. I don't know why they chose to do that. That's going to space out the, it's going to make the Soviet units have a harder time coming on the map than they would moving on the map in formation. So I almost feel like this is a mistake. Warsaw Pact march order. So each Warsaw Pact unit is divided into 2 columns, and this is going to be in the specific rules how you divide these up, and they come in specific order. Each of those columns comes in on 1 road. You have choices, it's generally like reinforcements are by a map edge or whatever. So you can bring 1 column in on 1 roadway, you can bring another column in on another roadway where it can support each other. If that's not going to work out for you, you can bring them one after the other on a single roadway, and that includes Autobahns. And that's basically the short of it. Non-divisional units can be attached to divisional columns, etc. EW. Both players get EW points according to an EW chart, I think is not in this game, it's in the specific rules. At the beginning of each game turn, you roll to see how many points, actually, you just check the chart to see how many points you get. I don't know if you roll, but I think it's just a fixed amount. and you cross-reference the turn with the map being used. If more than one map is used, the results in multiple columns can be used. However, you can only use the points on the map they belong on. That may change. I'm not convinced that that has remained this way. Each point can be used by the owning player to do electronic warfare. During the combat procedure, the attacker declares that he's conducting EW and records the expenditure of a point. He rolls a die. If the NATO player is conducting the attack, a 1 through 4 is successful. For Warsaw Pact, it's a 1 through 3. This is done after all the participating friendly units have been declared. EW can be conducted during the resolution of any combat in any friendly player phase, providing you have the points. But you can only spend 1 EW point per attack. If it's successful, the defender doesn't get a chance to bring their artillery and helicopters into play, or airpoints for that matter. And you record the expenditure of the point. All right, I'm going to pull out other pieces of rules that exist, but I'm going to step away a little bit because it's going to take me some time to assimilate it all. Oh, bother. I just found in the Vulhers packet a list of all the reinforcements and where they're supposed to come, and this would have actually helped. I think I have to go through this and recheck everything, because I did things off the Donau front, the North German Plain and Donau front over on that side, the basic rules for that. And this actually spells out what he actually intended to put into play here. I probably am close to it, but yeah, I forgot that was here. I'll jump to some of the other things. This rule book I can put here. Here's the grand campaign scenario. This was what came out when Beor came out, and it tells me, I think, the exclusive rules in sort of a coordinated fashion for those 3 games, and there's additional charts in the Vollers packet to handle the 2 new ones. NATO supply sources, as per Beor, 5th Corps is to an Autobahn or road leading off the west edge or the south edge. I wish they had put the Beor stuff in here as well. And NATO and Hofgap leading off the west edge. I think in general it's the roads. There may be something special in Beor, like there may be an on-map supply source, but I highly doubt that. Air power and chemicals. Warsaw Pact initially has air superiority based on Beor. Great. We're gonna have to pull the Beor rules out. I think they're here. All right, so let's look at that first one. What was it? Supply sources on Beor. 21.71. West edge of the map. Yeah. And it's 4 game turns of automatic supply for the Warsaw Pact. And my battery's dying. I'll swap it out. But first, okay, artillery is not auto-supplied for firing. If you fire, well, it's not auto-supplied, period. If you want to recover artillery points, you have to maintain your supply, even right at the beginning of the game. Air power and chemicals, Warsaw Pact initial air superiority is 21.2. Prior to the start of the game, the Warsaw Pact player rolls a die to see how much air superiority they have. This will be the number of game turns starting with turn 1 in which they automatically have air superiority. And the air power table is not used. However, it will be consulted each AM turn, and there's 2 turns per day, AM, PM. You will have to consult it to see if there's fog, but otherwise, Soviets are going to get air superiority. Again, I don't think I want to use the house rule here that gives you partial air power for the other side. I just feel like it's a complication I don't want to deal with, and there's plenty in here already. The Warsaw Pact player can do a preemptive strike. Okay, let's keep looking. He gets 12 air units per map. That's going to work out to be like 60 air power that he can use throughout the board. When NATO gets air superiority, he gets 18 per map, which will be larger. The Warsaw Pact player may conduct a preemptive airstrike against 6 hex groups per map in play. This total of strikes can be apportioned among the game maps as he wishes. That's 21.5. I think you choose how many air points you want to just throw. Let's see. During air power segment of game turn 1 only, preemptive strike against hex groups. Each hex group consists of target hex and the 6 hexes adjacent to it. NATO units occupying those hexes will gain a variable number of FPs. The Warsaw Pact player chooses the appropriate number of hex groups anywhere on the map by declaring the target's hex number. No hex can be in more than one hex group that's being bombed. The Warsaw Pact rolls the dice once for each NATO unit in a hex group, and then subtracts 1 from the die roll for every unit except artillery and helicopters. If the die result is less than or equal to the unit's max FP level, the unit gains that number of FPs. If it exceeds, it's treated as though it equaled the max FP, except in the case of artillery and helicopters. A roll of 6 for one of these units eliminates the unit entirely, removing it from the game. FPs gained by a unit as a result of preemptive strike may be removed normally in the ensuing friction point removal. I got to swap. To map and off map, NATO and Warsaw Pact can move from one playing area to another across the hex row where the 2 maps overlap. That, I've got that set up on the board already. You can support fire on another map as long as you don't trace across off-map territory. I don't really buy that. I feel like if I really need to trace artillery fire, not helicopters, but if I really need to trace artillery fire from here to here, I should be able to count the off-map hexes. There's nothing that would normally prevent that, so I'm just going to use some common sense there. Rules be damned. It's highly unlikely. The edges of the map are going to be Soviet-controlled where there's any real possibility of off-map activity, or the Soviets have won a massive victory if they're able to, get to, say, that corner over there. At least on that map they have. Okay, but there's more. Airborne units can be dropped on any map. During any helicopters also have to trace on map. I buy that more because there's capability to interact with helicopters at least under certain conditions. During any friendly player phase, any number of NATO units can be exited off the south edge of 5th Corps and immediately re-entered into play on the west edge of Hof Gap. That's this movement, and I think there's going to be a similar. There may not be, because this is not NATO territory, and they're not allowed to go wandering outside of NATO, I think. We'll take a look at how that goes. And vice versa. Similarly, NATO units may be exited off the north edge of 5th Corps and re-entered during the next NATO friendly on the west edge of the Bayor map. Does that make sense? That seems opposite. Yeah, I think that's opposite. I mean, Fifth Corps is this one that's sticking there. If I go the north edge of that, and then the west edge, I just don't buy that. I think this is fucked up. In order to do so, a unit must be exited from a road or autobahn leading off the appropriate map edge and must have at least 6 operation points remaining. So I think what they mean is the west edge of Fifth Corps to the north edge of the Bayor map. Because the other way just doesn't make much sense. Anyway, they must be exited from a road or autobahn leading off and must be at least 6 operation points remaining in its allowance for the phase doing so. In the immediate following player phase, the unit must enter the other map as a reinforcement and may only expend 6 operations points. And remember, that'll be certainly during the same turn, which means you'll be expending at least 2 friction points on movement to do that little thing. I think it's unlikely, but we'll hold. NATO paralysis. Non-West German NATO units are subject to special movement and combat restrictions during the first game turn of the scenario. At the beginning of game turn 2 and thereafter, the restrictions cease to apply. But the following are not subject to restrictions. On the Bayor map, British units east of the Weser, which is the Weser? Ah, that's not it. I think this is the Weser. Yeah. And of course, I don't have similar rules for the other 2 maps, so I don't know. East of the Weser and units of the 4th Armored Division as well as Belgian units initially deployed. On 5th Corps and Hofgap, all units of the 2nd and 11th Armored Cavalry Regiments, yeah, those are the delaying forces. And the 215-3 Mechanized Infantry, this couple of units that are up at the front, and any units in a major training center. New concept. Non-West German NATO units, except those listed above, may not expend operation points in any manner. Artillery and helicopter units may not support a combat or use counter battery fire. I'm going to try to make some shit up as to these, especially for these other maps. U.S. major training areas. Before the NATO player sets up his units, I haven't done that. He uses the MTA table, 3173. There's the electronic warfare, but I've got a better one over here. But there may be a better version in the Volers that handles the extra maps. And that's going to indicate some U.S. units. Actually, I don't think there are U.S. units on... There aren't any on this map, and I don't think there are any here. Doesn't look like it. That looks like it's West Germans. What's interesting in the game, I didn't mention this, I've got a number of different colored units. These are French, and it takes them forever to get on the board. The blue units over on this map, which look exactly the same, and I couldn't tell them apart, are actually Dutch units. A whole shitload of Dutch. I didn't expect that many. I didn't know the Dutch had that big an army, which definitely confused me. Anyway, you determine which U.S. brigade is currently in a major training area. You roll a die to see which column to refer, blah, blah, blah. After you determine the brigade, you consult the master unit deployment list and put those units, and they'll be someplace on Hof Gap. Mechanized infantry enter play as reinforcements. Do I even want to deal with this? I don't know. Special airborne air mobile rules. British, West German, and East German airborne infantry are all eligible for airborne drop in accordance with the normal rules. They are, however, non-motorized, and when being moved, they treat all road. This is nothing special. Furthermore, they're treated as company-sized units for purpose of exerting zone of controls, like I'll remember. Units from Beor, which are eligible for air mobile, are detailed in 21.8 of the Beor rules. 15th Paratrooper, 100th Royal Artillery 5 artillery units are always air mobile. And then there's some units that can be converted that are listed there, including some Soviets. Okay. Units from the Beor game, which are eligible for air mobile, are detailed. The following units from Hofgap, 5th Corps, are eligible as well, because this was a new rule. All East German, Czech, and Soviet motorized rifle regiments, all Soviet airborne mechanized battalions. Yeah. All U.S. 2-8 mechanized infantry battalions. East and West German airborne infantry and Soviet airborne artillery are always eligible for air mobile. Victory conditions, who cares? I mean, seriously. We got victory conditions for all 3 maps here. I don't know if there's anything that puts the 5 together in that. Now, there's one more little packet to look at. One neat thing about the Voeller's rules is he's got a nice summary of the rules. It's big still. It's like 3 full pages or something. But it gives a lot of information in kind of an easy to review format. It's not what I would use to look up a rule if I'm trying to figure something out. It's not as complete, etc. But it was very helpful to just scan a bunch of stuff and get an idea of what's going on. I mean, I have played this in the past. It's a long time ago, but some of it was pretty tight on my mind still, whatever that might mean. Okay, so we have lots of information here, lots of words. Optional rules, what do we want to deal with? Warsaw Pact March order diagrams, what do we care about? These will be included in the 2 remaining games of this series, which, again, after the TSR takeover, they got dropped. I don't know if, what's his name, Camps? If Camps was one of the people who just said, screw you to TSR, I don't want to do this, or I think probably more likely, because, you know, I'm just guesstimating, but, you know, if I was designing a game and the company changed names, I probably wouldn't abandon it. He wasn't one of the core SPI guys, so I feel more like this was his baby more than like he was committed to SPI, but who knows. Whatever, he came on for 3W to do them, but I just get the feeling that TSR said, you know what, this stuff's not selling all that well. Let's focus on the things that you know, we think are core to our ideal or whatever. Because they really stepped away from kind of a lot of more innovative and complicated stuff. They stuck with the big name stuff. You know, they put out another version of TSS. They put out the World War II thing, whatever. But all right. Nuclear warfare. All right, we'll go through these rules. I am really unlikely to use them because I think that the Soviet doctrine says no, and unless NATO uses them, and that NATO doesn't want to fuck around with that. Just because, you know, the whole die roll thing in the NATO game is the reason that I would stay away from it, because it's just too much of a chance of it causing a global war. But if you're losing terribly, maybe. All right, nuclear warfare can be initiated by either player. It's not simultaneous. Warsaw player resolves any nuclear attack he wishes before NATO resolves any of his. If NATO is the first player in the game to actually resolve them, the Warsaw Pact player can do his after on that player turn. There's a nuclear weapons chart here that lists the size of the bombs. Again, Voeller's has sort of like a mark-off sheet to indicate these things. And they have attack strengths and the number on each map that is available. And what do? You compare it to the nuclear defense strength of the unit under attack. The strength is 1 if the unit is soft, 2 if it's hard. And you roll it as if a prepared attack was being conducted in flat terrain. The die is then rolled and the defender's combat results is applied to the unit being attacked. Any number of nuclear weapons can be assigned to attack a given hex. However, a separate attack is conducted for each one. If more than one unit occupies a hex in which a nuclear attack is resolved, each unit is attacked separately by the full strength of the weapons. Unlike counter battery fire or whatever. Effects. Any combat result incurred by a unit defending in a nuclear attack must be applied as FP gain, no retreat. A unit subjected, whether it suffers FPs or not, may not expend any ops points in the next friendly player phase. The unit can be flipped to its FP side during the phase, however, to allow it to move later if it was the first phase of the turn. NATO units are prohibited from entering any hex subjected to a nuclear attack by either player in the first NATO player phase following the attack. Soviets don't care. The operation points for entering a hex subject to a nuclear attack is doubled for the entire game turn in which the attack is resolved. And there are some markers. These are definitely in there. I gotta swap batteries again, I fear. Oh, okay. NATO assignment of nuclear weapons. The NATO player must plot nuclear weapon expenditure 1 game turn in advance of actual employment. During the nuclear attack segment, they secretly write down the identity number of a target hex or a designation of a target hex unit for each nuclear weapon he wishes to employ. He must also note the type of weapon used and the method it'll be delivered, naming specific artillery units. Wow, that sounds like a nightmare. I don't think I want to do that. Again, it's an optional rule, and I don't think I'm going to use it. In fact, I may just say fuck it to all the optional rules, the static battalions. I don't know. There's some that I like. I like these. Warsaw Pact assignment, they do it in the same segment in which they're declared. They declare it against the target hex or whatever, and they adhere to a rigid schedule of nuclear weapon expenditure. In the first segment that the Warsaw Pact player conducts him, he may expend up to 33 nuclear weapons. In each of the next 6 that follows, he can expend up to 6. At the end of this period, he can expend a maximum of 3 per game turn for the remainder of the game. The NATO, I don't believe, has any such limitation there. Yeah, he can plot as many as he wishes in a single game turn. These are rules I will look up if I feel like NATO wants to launch an attack. Soviets would only launch one if they're actually losing, like if they're going to be losing ground. They're not going to try to clear space using nukes. I just don't believe that's part of their doctrine. Atomic demolition munitions. These can be used by the NATO player only. They're nuclear weapons for blowing up terrain. ADMs can only be assigned to a friendly NATO unit and only during the nuclear attack segment prior to the turn of use. After they're assigned, the holding unit may detonate the ADM in any one hex that it passes through during the course of its movement. This will give it the double movement and screw up autobahns, roads, and access hexes, which is also done there. An engineer that enters the hex on a demolition restores the normal entry cost of the hex, and it's only for 1 turn. West German territorial units. In each scenario, the NATO player may deploy a certain number of these things, little pieces of shit. Before the start of play, the NATO player secretly writes down the hex numbers of each city hex in which he wishes to place a static infantry battalion. Again, sounds like a hell of a lot of work for something that, yeah, it's going to have some effect, but I just don't know. During play, as soon as a Warsaw Pact unit moves adjacent to a city hex with a static battalion, the NATO player must declare the unit's presence. If Warsaw Pact occupies a hex controlled by that static battalion, it must cease its movement. And yeah, they're treated as a soft unit with an attack strength of 0, defense of 1. They may not move, attack, nor expend operation points. They can never retreat. NATO units of any nationality may be stacked in a hex occupied by a static battalion. If they retreat, the static battalion is destroyed. The FP level is shown by placing the FP marker in the hex they occupy. Honestly, I vaguely think that maybe I might use them as a completely non-pre-programmed thing, where I bop them in as I like, or maybe assign them per city, not per city hex. I don't know. I haven't decided. It just seems like it's a pain in the ass to write down. I won't remember where the hexes are. Currently, West German tactical thought is heavily influenced by the concept of forward defense. Yeah, currently. With the advent of this doctrine, traditional German excellence in mobile defense has been sacrificed with the idea of holding ground. No West German unit may retreat to fulfill combat loss requirements until it's within 2 FPs of being destroyed. Therefore, a West German mechanized or armored could not retreat until it had a total of 3. Similarly, a West German company could not retreat until it had absorbed at least 2, and artillery could not retreat until it accumulated 4, except when being attacked by counter battery fire. Polish unreliability. Now here is again where Vollers has an optional rule I don't want to use. He extends this rule to all of the non-Soviet Warsaw Pact units. I do not believe that that at all reflects the desires of the system. Now, there are no Poles in any of the 3 original games that came into play. The Poles show up, I believe, up here. They're these pink units, of course, because the Poles, had pink cav or something like that. Pink uniforms on their cav in the Napoleonic era. I don't know. But it was like very specific units. That were very, elite cav forces, but I don't remember what they were. But I think the rationale behind it was solidarity, and the Polish movements around that were a big deal at this time, and there was some question whether the Poles would fight, especially in an offensive fight. There is not that much question about the East Germans and the Czechs, who are the other forces in the pact that are coming across. So I'm going to go with just whatever this is, which is to simulate deteriorating morale, double all combat losses against Polish units from the combat results, and all Polish non-artillery units participating in an attack are subject to unreliability. For each such unit or stack, the Warsaw Pact player must roll a die on the Polish unreliability table based on the FPs that they have to attack. So if they've taken a lot of hits, they're going to be less likely to engage in the fight. This is done after you declare, this is done per stack after you declare that you're making an attack. Now, if you're not doing a multi-hex, honestly, if you're doing a multi-hex attack, you're just using one formation. So yeah, in almost all likelihood. So it's not that big a deal, but it is possible that like one stack could attack and another not, even with a multi-hex attack. So I don't know. Victory conditions are based on relative criteria, I love this, regarding Warsaw Pact advance rates and NATO's ability to retain control of urban areas. These victory conditions have been modified for game balance. The Warsaw Pact victory conditions based on their goals are presented below. The West Germans would consider the loss of 100 kilometers of terrain, about half the game map, as a devastating defeat. Soviet victory conditions are judged by what hex they're on. And where do we have, I thought we had competing victory conditions. NATO ability to retain. I thought both sides had different victory conditions. I don't know, because I don't seem to have a chart for NATO victory conditions. Exiting enemy-controlled hexes if the phasing player is attempting to move all the units. This is an update to reflect. The rules we read have this. This is just an update for the Hofgap and 5th Corps rules. Hofgap terrain. Units may not move, advance, retreat into or out of rough terrain except through Audubon Road or access hex sides on the Hofgap map. Units may conduct normal attacks and exert zones of control into these hexes. Air mobile and airborne infantry units only are exempt from those restrictions. That is most of the rules. There may be some more kicking around somewhere that I need to fish out. I'm going to have to complete my setup. And what do I have to do there? I have to get, well, first of all, I have to look up and see about these stacks, because stacking is 2 per hex. So why the hell are all these units overstacked? And there were some over here, and there still are some, that I feel like I have to spread out to some extent. I have to check the major training area if I want to bother. Historically, I should, but. And I have to look over all the Soviet reinforcements again, based on the Voeller's chart, to make sure that I've got things right there. I think I do. And honestly, maybe it's just close enough and I go ahead. Because I'm fucking sick of setting this game up. It's taken over a week to get it set up. I mean, you saw I had the map set up earlier. But it's just, mainly, it's not because, I haven't been doing it constantly throughout a week or whatever. I could probably get it set up in a couple of days had I been working consistently. But it hurts my back, and it's getting dark. Dark is going to be hard to play and to deal with this game. And I've been doing lots of raid. So anyway, I'll set this up. No guarantees on how far I'm going to get. Like I said, I had this set up in the summer at one point when I first had the 3 games, and I had it set up all fucking summer, and I barely got much done at all. I got a few turns in, but I wasn't the same person I am today. And also, it was a really, really uncomfortable situation. I was essentially outside playing, as it were. There wasn't a lot of light. It was just horrible, and I had to crawl around on the table. The next time I did it, I think I did it in Buffalo, trying to set it all up, and I just didn't have the willpower to do it. And that's what I'm more afraid of, is that I'll fuck around with this and just be like, I don't know what I'm doing. It's a fucking operational, like, modern-ish 20th century game. These just aren't my thing, and damned if I know why I keep buying OCS games. Am I going to like them still when I start getting to the larger ones? I don't know. We shall see. We shall see. But, this has been something that was on my short list. And, I went through all the effort to make these counters and everything, and I'm like, screw it, let's get this on the table and bump it ahead of things that I actually am more interested in playing, like DAC or Empire's Arms or a bunch of other things that are going to take a big hunk of time. I don't know if this is going to take that big a hunk of time, though, because I may be just so miserable playing it. Between, the game itself, which I never really felt like it clicked with me terribly well, and these kind of fudge, my shitty ass homemade counters. Nothing against the the scans that were available, although I do believe they have some errors in them. I think those errors got corrected, but they didn't get corrected before I printed it out. Anyway, up it goes.